At the annual family barbecue, smoke from the massive outdoor grill mingled with the heavy scent of expensive cologne and performative perfection. It was a gathering designed to showcase our family to the rest of the neighborhood. My 8-year-old son Malik was playing quietly near the patio when he simply asked for a small slice of Wagyu beef from the extravagant serving platter. My sister Brianna snatched the ceramic plate right out of his small hand with lightning speed. She looked down her perfectly contoured nose and announced to the entire patio that premium cuts of meat were only for children with a real future. The sheer cruelty of the statement hung in the air, but no one jumped to defend my son. Everyone present, including my own parents, nodded in silent agreement to her words. My brother-in-law Trent, a white investment banker who loved to insert himself into our family dynamics and play the role of the wealthy benefactor, smirked from his comfortable lounge chair. He tossed a crumpled $20 bill onto the table and told Malik to go buy a hot dog because his mother clearly could not afford the expensive meat on her own. I did not yell at them and I did not cry. I refused to give them the reaction they were desperately trying to provoke. I quietly took our paper plates, grabbed my son by his hand, and walked out of that toxic environment without looking back. But the true horror began at exactly 12:05 that night, when my phone lit up with a text message from Brianna. The message read, "Remember that trip to the woods last year? You survived, but now your son is mine. My name is Corinne. I am 32 years old and a forensic fraud investigator. If you have ever been the scapegoat of a family that values high society status over your very survival, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe because you will want to hear exactly how I systematically dismantled their generational wealth overnight." The glowing screen of my smartphone cast a harsh and unforgiving light across my dark living room. I stared at the text message again and felt a cold wave of realization wash over me. Most mothers would have broken down into a hysterical panic at the sight of such a blatant and malicious threat from their own flesh and blood. Most women would have crumbled under the suffocating weight of knowing their family was plotting to take their only child. But I did not shed a single tear. The time for crying had ended exactly 1 year ago, when I crawled out of the Appalachian Mountains with dirt packed deep under my fingernails and the bitter sting of betrayal burning in my veins. I calmly locked my phone, grabbed my car keys, and walked out into the thick, humid Atlanta night. I climbed into my car and drove straight toward the affluent gated community of Buckhead, where Brianna and Trent lived in a sprawling $4 million modern estate. The drive was a blur of passing streetlights and deep shadows, but my mind was laser-focused on the reality of the situation. They thought I was weak. They truly believed that because I did not attend a prestigious institution like Spelman College, like the rest of the women in my family, because I chose a state university and married a hardworking man instead of a wealthy corporate executive, I was somehow ignorant. They equated my modest lifestyle with a lack of intelligence and a lack of power. That was their very first mistake. As a forensic accountant, I spent my days analyzing intricate patterns of financial deception and hunting corporate predators for a living. I knew exactly what my family was capable of, and I understood the lengths they would go to in order to preserve their flawless facade of excellence. For decades, my parents had cultivated an image of absolute perfection within the elite circles of Atlanta society. They attended all the right galas, served on all the right boards, and desperately hid anything that did not align with their carefully curated narrative of success. I was the stain on their perfect portrait. My late husband was a loving and devoted father who ran a small local shipping business, but to my parents he was just a laborer who brought down their social standing. He drove delivery trucks instead of wearing Italian leather shoes. When he passed away, they did not mourn him. They saw his death as an opportunity to correct what they viewed as my ultimate mistake. And now they were using my sister Brianna and her wealthy white husband to execute their final move. I pulled up to the massive wrought iron gates of the estate and bypassed the intercom entirely, using the universal access code I had uncovered months ago during my private investigations into their finances. The heavy gates swung open, and I drove up the long circular driveway. The manicured lawns and towering white columns of the house were meant to project an image of untouchable superiority to the world. It was a pristine and imposing facade, hiding the deep moral rot festering inside. There were two police cruisers parked haphazardly near the entrance, alongside a dark, unmarked sedan. I stepped out of my car, feeling the sharp crunch of expensive gravel beneath my boots. I marched up the wide marble steps and did not even bother knocking. I raised my foot and kicked the heavy oak double doors open with enough physical force to make the ornate brass handles rattle against the wood. The scene waiting for me inside the grand living room was perfectly staged and meticulously orchestrated. Brianna sat perched on the edge of a custom velvet sofa, dabbing her dry eyes with a silk tissue. She wore her Ivy League surgeon persona, like a tailored suit projecting the image of a deeply concerned and heartbroken aunt. Beside her stood Trent, wearing a casual but clearly expensive cashmere sweater. Trent was a man who wore his racial privilege like a weapon, constantly deploying subtle microaggressions against me, while pretending to be the progressive savior of our prominent black family. Standing opposite the two of them were two uniformed police officers with their hands resting cautiously near their duty belts. Next to the officers stood a stern-looking woman, clutching a thick clipboard, undoubtedly an agent from the State Child Protective Services Division. Trent smirked the moment I walked through the broken doorway. The corner of his mouth twitched with that familiar arrogant superiority he always displayed whenever he thought he held the absolute upper hand in a situation. He turned his attention to the taller police officer and handed over a thick manila folder filled with fabricated documents. "Officer, I told you she would show up like this," Trent said, his tone dripping with a highly rehearsed and fake concern. "My sister-in-law is clearly having another severe psychotic break. She is completely erratic and deeply dangerous. She abandoned her own son at our family barbecue earlier today and has been unresponsive for hours while wandering the city. We had no choice but to call the authorities for the immediate safety of the child." I stood frozen in the absolute center of the vast, opulent room, keeping my breathing slow and steady. The police officers shifted their weight, assessing me as a potential physical threat. The Child Protective Services agent stepped forward, holding up her clipboard like a shield. "Mom, we received a very distressing and credible report regarding your mental stability and the welfare of your 8-year-old son. We are here tonight to execute an emergency removal order and place the child in the temporary custody of his aunt and uncle." Before I could even open my mouth to respond to the agent, a dark shadow moved near the grand, winding staircase at the back of the room. My mother Rosalind stepped gracefully into the light. She was fully dressed despite the late hour, her signature string of heavy pearls resting perfectly against her collarbone. Her face was set in a cold mask of practiced disappointment, a look I had endured for my entire life. "Corinne, please do not make a terrible scene," she said, her voice echoing sharply off the high vaulted ceilings. "We absolutely cannot have the neighbors waking up and seeing police cars at this hour. You are acting just like you did when you disgracefully dropped out of Spelman College and ruined your future. You have always been so mentally unstable, so entirely incapable of upholding the basic standards of this family." I looked quietly at the woman who gave birth to me, the woman who valued her prestigious standing in elite social clubs vastly more than the safety and happiness of her own daughter. "You are very sick," Corinne Rosalind continued, stepping closer to Trent and Brianna to form a united and impenetrable front against me. "The officers need to understand your deeply troubled history. You wandered into the Appalachian woods last year during our family retreat and nearly died from your own reckless delusions. You are completely unfit to raise Malik. You cannot even take care of your own basic needs. Let Trent and Brianna give him the life your late husband never could." I stood there absorbing the sheer magnitude of their coordinated betrayal. The narrative they were spinning was flawlessly designed to strip me of my credibility, my freedom, and my child. They were weaponizing my grief against me. After my husband died unexpectedly, I had experienced a period of profound mourning. I was heartbroken and exhausted trying to navigate life as a single mother while maintaining a demanding career, investigating financial crimes. My family had suggested a quiet weekend retreat in a remote cabin in the Appalachian Mountains, claiming it would help me heal and reconnect with nature. I had trusted them. I had believed that despite our lifelong differences and their constant criticisms, they genuinely wanted to support me through my darkest hour. Instead, they had isolated me. They had created a situation designed to make me appear completely unhinged to the outside world. And now they were using that fabricated history to justify stealing my son. I looked at Trent, who was visibly relishing the moment. He genuinely believed that his wealth, his status, and his skin color gave him the ultimate authority to dictate the course of my life. He looked at me not as a human being, but as a minor obstacle standing between him and whatever sinister goal he was truly pursuing. I looked at Brianna, my own sister, who had spent her entire life competing with me for our parents' approval. She had the medical degree, the massive house, the expensive cars, and the socially acceptable husband, yet she still felt the need to take the one beautiful thing I had left in this world. And finally, I looked at my mother, whose eyes held no maternal warmth, only a cold, calculating desire to erase the shame I supposedly brought upon her carefully manufactured legacy. The room was suffocatingly quiet, save for the soft hum of the central air conditioning and the ticking of a massive grandfather clock in the hallway. The police officers took a step closer to me, clearly preparing to make an arrest if I displayed any signs of the aggression Trent had accused me of. The Child Protective Services worker tapped her pen against her clipboard, waiting for my inevitable breakdown. They all expected me to scream. They expected me to fall to my knees and beg for mercy. They expected the exact erratic behavior that would perfectly validate the false story they had just told the authorities. I did not give them that satisfaction. Instead, I looked directly at the taller police officer and then shifted my gaze to Trent's smug face. I slowly reached into my leather tote bag. The officers instantly tensed their hands, moving swiftly to their weapons, but I moved with deliberate and unthreatening slowness. I pulled out a crisp manila envelope of my own and extracted a single legally binding document stamped with the official seal of the state court. I held the document up so the Child Protective Services agent could clearly read the bold heading across the top of the page. I did not abandon him, I said, my voice ringing out with absolute and unwavering clarity. I transferred temporary physical and legal custody of Malik to the State Department of Child Welfare exactly 3 hours ago under a specialized protective order. The agent frowned, stepping forward to inspect the paper, her eyes widening as she recognized the federal seals and signatures. I locked eyes with Trent, watching the arrogant smirk finally slide off his pale face. You cannot take a child that is currently under active federal protection. I continued, dropping the document onto the glass coffee table. Your emergency removal order is entirely void and completely legally useless. Trent pulled his shoulders back and his face turned a violent shade of crimson. He snatched the federal custody document from the glass coffee table and his eyes darted frantically across the page. He was a wealthy Wall Street investment banker and a man who was entirely accustomed to bending the world to his will with a single phone call. He looked at the federal seal and the judge signature and the undeniable proof that he had just been outmaneuvered by the very black woman he constantly demeaned and considered beneath him. He crumpled the edge of the thick paper and turned his blazing fury toward the 2 police officers standing in his living room. "Arrest her right now," he demanded. His voice was booming with the unearned authority of a privileged white man who is accustomed to absolute obedience from local law enforcement. "She is trespassing in my home. She broke my front door. I want her in handcuffs immediately." The taller police officer stepped forward and carefully took the document from Trent's shaking hand. The officer read the federal paperwork, his professional demeanor shifting instantly from aggressive to highly cautious. The officer looked directly at me and then turned his attention back to Trent. "Sir, this is a perfectly valid federal protective order," the officer said calmly. We cannot arrest a mother for checking on her child when she has already surrendered temporary physical custody to the state. Her presence here tonight is not a kidnapping attempt or a criminal act. It is a simple welfare check. Trent stepped aggressively into the officer's personal space, trying to use his tall height and his custom-tailored suit to intimidate a man in a police uniform. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Trent spat out angrily. "I play golf with the police commissioner of this city. I sit on the board of the Municipal Development Fund. This woman is a severe danger to herself and everyone around her. She belongs locked away in a psychiatric ward, not wandering the streets of Buckhead." When verbal intimidation failed to work on the police officers, manipulation quickly took over. Brianna stepped smoothly in front of her husband and gently placed a manicured hand on his chest to pull him back. She smoothed down her expensive silk dress and looked at the officers with a perfectly practiced expression of deep clinical sorrow. "Officers, please forgive my husband," she said softly. Her voice was incredibly steady and coded in the soothing, authoritative tone she used daily to deliver bad news to patients in her prestigious surgical ward. "We are just absolutely terrified for my young nephew. My sister is very sick. She suffers from severe paranoia and dangerous delusions. She has been this way ever since her husband passed away, and her mental state is rapidly deteriorating." Brianna looked at me with an expression of fake pity that made my stomach turn. "Corinne, sweetheart, you have to stop doing this," she pleaded, holding her hands out toward me. "You are scaring everyone in the family. You keep hallucinating these wild conspiracy theories. You actually believe that we tried to drug you during our family retreat." She turned back to the Child Protective Services agent and shook her head tragically. "My sister wandered into the Appalachian woods last year completely out of her mind with grief. She got lost for 3 days in the dangerous wilderness. We searched everywhere for her, and we were sick with worry. Ever since she was finally rescued, she has been spinning these insane fantasies that her own family tried to poison her. She needs intensive psychiatric help and heavy medication, not custody of a vulnerable child." I did not raise my voice and I did not flinch. I just stared at my older sister and admired the absolute perfection of her theatrical performance. She had always been the golden child of our household. She was the brilliant Ivy League surgeon who brought immense prestige to our parents' relentless pursuit of black excellence. She drove a pristine imported luxury car and wore perfectly tailored designer clothes and spoke with the measured cadence of someone who believed she was intellectually superior to everyone else in the room. But I knew the actual truth. I knew that beneath the expensive silk fabrics and the impressive medical accolades, she was a hollow and deeply insecure woman. She resented me because despite my lack of interest in their high society games and elite social clubs, I had found genuine happiness. My late husband had loved me with a fierce and unconditional devotion that Trent had never once shown to Brianna. My husband had looked at me like I was the only beautiful woman in the world, while Trent looked at Brianna like a strategic investment to diversify his corporate portfolio. And more than anything else, Brianna hated me because I had given birth to Malik. She had spent a massive fortune on specialized fertility treatments, desperately trying to produce a biological heir for Trent's family trust, only to fail time and time again. She wanted my son because her own body was barren, and she was fully willing to eliminate me to get him. "I hallucinated?" I asked, letting the cold question hang in the heavy air of the lavish living room. I turned my gaze away from Brianna and focused entirely on my mother Rosalind, who was still standing defensively near the grand staircase. "Mom, do you remember that specific night by the campfire?" I asked quietly. "You came to my cabin. You sat beside me on the wooden bench stroking my hair and telling me how incredibly hard it must be to raise a growing boy all alone. You brought me a steaming mug of tea. You called it a special herbal remedy. You told me it was a secret generational recipe to help me sleep and to cure the heavy, painful grief I was carrying over my dead husband. I actually trusted you. You were my mother and I believed you wanted to comfort me. I drank every last drop of that tea because I thought you finally cared about my pain." Rosalind clutched her string of expensive pearls so tightly, I thought the delicate wire might snap and send the jewels scattering across the hardwood floor. She refused to make eye contact with me. I remember the exact moment my limbs started to go completely numb. I continued keeping my eyes locked on my mother's trembling hands. I remember the way the bright campfire suddenly blurred into a meaningless streak of orange light. I remember stumbling blindly out of the cabin and desperately trying to find my phone in the dark. I tried to call for help as my throat closed up and my legs gave out beneath me. You watched me stumble into the dark, dangerous woods. I said, my voice dropping to a harsh and steady whisper. You and Calvin and Brianna all stood there and watched. You watched me fall into the thick, thorny brush miles away from any trace of civilization, and you did absolutely nothing to help me. You packed up your luxury rental cars the very next morning and drove back to your pristine, wealthy lives in Atlanta. You left the family disappointment to die alone in the cold wilderness, so you could finally take my son and claim his inheritance. Brianna let out a loud, theatrical gasp. Listen to her, she pleaded, turning toward the two police officers. Listen to the aggressive paranoia in her voice. She is completely detached from reality. We left the cabin early that morning because of a severe storm warning. We truly thought she had driven home ahead of us. No one drugged you, Corinne. You had a terrible mental breakdown and wandered off. You need to be in a hospital right now. I reached into my structured leather tote bag for the second time tonight. The police officers instinctively placed their hands near their duty belts again, but they did not draw their weapons. They were captivated by the cold and undeniable conviction resonating in my voice. When the local search and rescue team finally found me at the bottom of a steep, rocky ravine. 3 days later, I was severely dehydrated and barely conscious, I said, pulling out a thick, sealed medical folder. The rural hospital in Maryland treated me for extreme exposure to the elements. They pumped me full of intravenous fluids and told the local media it was a tragic hiking accident caused by a grieving widow who lost her way. But I never told you guys what the hospital laboratory actually found in my blood when I crawled out of those woods, did I? I slammed the heavy medical folder onto the glass coffee table right next to the federal custody document. The sharp, violent smack echoed loudly through the massive living room. Trent flinched backward. Rosalind took a clumsy step away, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. I opened the manila folder and slid a certified, stamped toxicology report across the smooth glass toward the Child Protective Services agent. Read it, I commanded softly. The agent cautiously picked up the paper, and her eyes scanned the highlighted lines of complex medical data. I did not wait for her to speak or interpret the findings. I recited the detailed results purely from memory, knowing every single chemical compound by heart. The extensive lab results showed massive and near-lethal levels of rohypnol in my system, I said, watching my sister's face carefully for any sign of movement. A heavy and highly illegal sedative. But that was not the most interesting part of the blood work. The interesting part was the secondary chemical they found layered beneath the sedative. It was a highly restricted and incredibly fast-acting surgical anesthetic. The exact kind of potent anesthetic that is not available on the street. The kind that absolutely cannot be prescribed by a normal general practitioner or a local pharmacy. I took a slow and deliberate step toward Brianna, forcing her to look at me. It is a highly specialized paralytic agent used almost exclusively in complex cardiovascular surgeries, I said. An expensive anesthetic that is only stocked in the secure pharmacy vault at the exact surgical ward where you currently serve as the chief attending physician, Brianna. The absolute silence that followed my words was entirely deafening. Brianna's rich and flawless brown skin drained of all its vibrant color, leaving her looking ashen and terrifyingly hollow. Her mouth parted slightly, but no arrogant words came out to defend herself. The elite Ivy League-educated surgeon was suddenly stripped of all her manufactured superiority and replaced by the terrifying realization that her darkest and most lethal secret was sitting in black and white on her own coffee table. Trent looked at his wife, and his brow furrowed in genuine confusion and rising panic. He knew they had plotted to get rid of me legally and socially, but the sheer clinical reality of the medical evidence was something he had clearly not prepared for. He thought they were just playing dirty family politics, but he was now staring at physical proof of a major violent felony. "I am a forensic financial investigator," I reminded them, and my voice cut through the silence like a freshly sharpened scalpel. "I track hidden missing assets and complex shell companies and deeply buried fraudulent transactions for a living. You honestly thought I would not pull my own comprehensive medical records after a near-death experience. You actually thought I would not track the exact batch number of that surgical anesthetic back to your specific hospital supply logs. I have already submitted a formal anonymous request to the Hospital Administration Board to audit their strict pharmacy inventory from the exact week of our family retreat. They are going to find a missing vial, Brianna, and they are going to find your secure digital signature right there on the pharmacy access log." The taller police officer looked at Brianna, and his hand moved slowly away from his belt and crossed over his chest. The entire dynamic in the room had shifted permanently. I was no longer the erratic, grieving widow trespassing in a wealthy neighborhood. I was a highly trained professional, presenting a credible and heavily documented accusation of attempted murder against a prominent public figure. The Child Protective Services agent slowly lowered her clipboard, and her eyes darted nervously between me and my frozen sister. Trent tried desperately to recover his footing. He stepped aggressively in front of the coffee table, trying to physically block the police officers from looking too closely at the toxicology report. "This is completely absurd," Trent stammered, and his voice was entirely losing its booming, confident edge. "This is obviously a forged document. She probably typed it up herself on a cheap home printer. She is a fraud investigator, so she knows exactly how to manipulate paperwork to look real. You cannot possibly take this nonsense seriously." I smiled at him with a cold and empty expression that made him take a quick step back. "I do not need the police to take it seriously tonight, Trent," I said. "I do not need them to arrest her right now in her designer dress. I brought this report here to prove a very specific point to the state agent standing in your living room." I turned my attention back to the Child Protective Services worker, who was watching me intently. "As you can clearly see, I am not a delusional woman having a psychotic break. I am a highly observant mother who recognized a coordinated and lethal threat against my life orchestrated by my own family. I surrendered temporary physical custody of my son to the state specifically to keep him completely out of the hands of the people who actively tried to murder me. Malik is currently sleeping safely in a secure and undisclosed federal foster facility where their dirty money and their political influence cannot ever reach him. He is entirely untouchable. The morning sun barely crests the Atlanta skyline before the brutal reality of my situation shifted from the lavish living room of my sister's mansion to the cold and sterile environment of the Fulton County Family Courthouse. The air inside the building felt thick and oppressive, smelling of floor wax and stale coffee. I sat at the heavy wooden defense table next to my attorney, a sharp and unassuming woman named Sarah, who specialized in unraveling complex financial family disputes. Across the aisle, my father Calvin had assembled a legal team that looked like they had stepped out of a high-end corporate brochure. There were 4 men in immaculate dark suits, whispering among themselves and shuffling stacks of thick legal folders. My father sat in the center of them, radiating an aura of untouchable authority. He wore his tailored navy suit and his signature gold tie clip, projecting the very image of black excellence that he had spent his entire life ruthlessly cultivating. Beside him sat Trent, looking irritatingly confident as he leaned back in his leather chair. Brianna was not present, likely still recovering from the utter humiliation of the toxicology report from the night before. But her absence was more than compensated for by the sheer arrogant weight of the men in the room. The judge presiding over our emergency hearing was an older man with silver hair and a weary expression. I knew exactly who he was. He was a prominent figure in the local country club scene and a man who frequently attended the same exclusive charity galas as my parents. The systemic corruption of it all was suffocating. My family had purposely maneuvered this emergency petition into the courtroom of a man who already respected my father and who would naturally view me through the tainted lens my family had provided. The hearing began without delay, and Trent was the very first person called to the witness stand. He adjusted his expensive cashmere tie and offered the judge a polite and deferential smile, perfectly playing the role of the concerned and responsible uncle. As Trent began to speak, his words were laced with every subtle microaggression and racial stereotype he could politely weaponize in a court of law. He did not raise his voice, but his tone was dripping with a quiet, insidious condescension. He described me as an angry and aggressive woman who was completely incapable of managing her own emotions. He told the judge that I was consistently hostile toward my family, and that I lashed out whenever anyone tried to offer me logical guidance. He painted a vivid and entirely fabricated picture of a hysterical widow who was financially illiterate and prone to violent outbursts. I sat perfectly still listening to this wealthy white investment banker use his inherent privilege to diminish my humanity. He told the court that I lacked the basic temperament to handle the substantial assets my late husband had supposedly left behind. He leaned forward and placed a hand on his chest, claiming that he and Brianna only wanted to provide my 8-year-old son Malik with a stable and structured environment. An environment free from the constant chaos of a mother who could not control her temper or her bank accounts. Trent spoke with such smooth conviction that anyone who did not know the truth would have believed he was a saint descending from Wall Street to rescue a neglected child. He used words like volatile and uncooperative to describe my perfectly reasonable boundaries. He was wrapping his deep-seated misogyny and racism in the polite language of a concerned family member. My lawyer, Sarah, placed a calming hand on my wrist under the table, but I did not need to be restrained. I was a forensic fraud investigator, and I knew how to read the subtle tells of a liar. As Trent spun his web of deceit, I watched the way his left thumb kept rubbing against his wedding band. I noticed the slight sheen of sweat forming at his temples despite the chill of the air conditioning. He was projecting an image of absolute control, but his body language screamed of a man drowning in invisible debt. He finished his testimony with a sad shake of his head, telling the judge that it broke his heart to see me spiral so far out of control. But the true emotional devastation did not come from Trent. It came when my own father, Calvin, was called to testify. My father walked to the stand with a slow and dignified stride, placing his hand on the Bible and swearing to tell the truth. He settled into the chair and locked eyes with the judge, immediately establishing a silent camaraderie of successful men. When his lawyer began asking questions, my father answered with a heavy and sorrowful baritone voice that commanded the entire room. He told the court that I had always been the broken link in our flawless family chain. He spoke about my childhood not with love, but with a deep and lingering disappointment. He detailed how he and my mother had provided every possible advantage, how they had paved a golden road for me to attend Spelman College and join the elite ranks of our society. And then he told the judge how I threw it all away. He described my decision to attend a state university and study forensic accounting as a deliberate and malicious rebellion against our family legacy. The knife twisted deeper when he began speaking about my late husband. My father did not use his name. He simply referred to the man I loved as a common laborer. He told the judge that my husband was a nobody, a simple construction worker who drove a dusty truck and dragged me down into a life of mediocrity. He said that I had ruined our family's elite lineage by choosing to marry so far beneath our station. The sheer classism and elitism in his words made my chest ache with a profound and hollow grief. My father was standing under oath in a court of law, telling the world that my beautiful, hard-working husband was worthless, simply because he did not wear a suit to work. He went on to claim that my grief over losing this common man had completely unhinged my mind. My father stated that I was too low class and too emotionally fragile to handle my son's future. He painted a picture of Malik growing up in a broken, impoverished home, unless the court intervened to place him in the wealthy and culturally superior hands of Trent and Brianna. He said that reputation and stability were everything, and that I possessed neither. I sat in my chair feeling the cold wood of the table against my palms, listening to the man who gave me life strip away every ounce of my dignity just to maintain his flawless country club facade. My father was willing to legally declare me an unfit mother just to keep the money and the power circulating within his approved social circle. The judge listened to my father's testimony with deep sympathetic nods. The shared understanding between the two men was palpable. The judge looked down at his notes and then looked over at me with an expression of profound pity, mixed with institutional disdain. I could see the decision forming in his mind. He had heard enough. He had heard the wealthy white savior explain how aggressive and volatile I was, and he had heard the prominent black patriarch confirm that I was a lifelong disappointment who married a nobody. The narrative was perfectly sealed. The judge folded his hands together and leaned toward his microphone. He stated that based on the compelling and deeply troubling testimony provided by my family, he had grave concerns about my mental stability and my capacity to provide a secure environment for my son. He reached for his heavy wooden gavel, preparing to bring it down and grant Calvin and Trent the emergency temporary conservatorship they needed to access Malik's accounts. My heart beat in a slow and calculated rhythm. I looked at Sarah and gave her a single definitive nod. Before the judge could strike the wooden block, my attorney stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. She apologized for the interruption and stated that the defense had a piece of critical digital evidence that had just been successfully retrieved and authenticated this very morning. She explained that this evidence spoke directly to the immediate safety of the child and the true financial motivations of the petitioners. My father's lead attorney immediately jumped to his feet, loudly objecting and claiming this was a desperate stalling tactic from an unstable woman. The judge frowned deeply, clearly annoyed by the disruption, but Sarah smoothly reminded the court that in emergency custody hearings, any evidence regarding imminent financial danger to the minor must be entered into the record. Reluctantly, the judge allowed it, instructing her to be quick. Sarah walked to the center of the courtroom, carrying a small digital audio player connected to a portable speaker. She placed it on the evidence table and stated that this was a voicemail recovered from a secure cloud server that I had been monitoring as part of my ongoing forensic investigations. I kept my eyes entirely focused on Trent. I watched the arrogant confidence completely evaporate from his face as he realized what device was sitting on that table. I knew his secrets. I knew that the polished investment banker was actually a degenerate gambler who leveraged his firm's assets in highly illegal offshore trades. I knew that he was drowning in obligations to people who did not send polite collection letters. Sarah pressed the play button. The audio was slightly grainy, but the slurred and panicked voice that echoed through the silent courtroom was unmistakably Trent's. He was drunk, and he was terrified. The recording played loudly, bouncing off the wood-paneled walls. Trent's voice cracked as he spoke, addressing my father. "If we do not get the kids' trust fund by Friday, the cartel is going to break my legs, Calvin." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The recording continued with Trent sobbing into the phone. "The Securities and Exchange Commission is already auditing my firm. They are pulling the ledger tomorrow. I am $30 million in the hole, Calvin. You have to get Corinne committed. You have to get the signature from the judge so we can route the boys' money to the Cayman accounts. If the money is not there by Friday, they are going to kill me, and they are going to come for you next." The audio clicked off, leaving a deafening and catastrophic silence in its wake. The color completely drained from Trent's face, leaving him looking like a fragile, terrified ghost. He gripped the edge of the witness stand, his knuckles turning completely white as his breathing grew rapid and shallow. His custom-tailored suit suddenly looked like a straitjacket. At the petitioner's table, my father's high-powered lawyers instinctively leaned away from him, as if his very presence was suddenly radioactive. Calvin dropped his head, his flawless posture collapsing under the crushing weight of public exposure. His carefully manicured image of black excellence was shattered in an instant, replaced by the ugly reality of a man who was actively conspiring to sell his own grandson's future to a violent cartel to cover a white man's gambling debts. The judge froze entirely. His hand remained suspended in midair, still loosely holding the gavel. His mouth parted slightly as he stared at my father, the man he shared country club dinners and charity galas with. The pristine reputation that my father had used to manipulate the court was instantly pulverized. The judge slowly lowered the gavel and looked over at me. I sat perfectly still, my face completely calm and unreadable. I had not screamed. I had not thrown a tantrum. I had not acted like the aggressive and volatile woman Trent had described. I had simply done my job. I was a forensic accountant, and I always followed the money. And today the money had led straight to their absolute destruction. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut behind us, and the absolute silence of the judge's chamber was instantly replaced by the chaotic, echoing noise of the courthouse hallway. My father, Calvin, burst through the doors. First, his face contorted in a mask of absolute fury and blind panic. His high-powered legal team, the men who had just been aggressively defending his flawless reputation, were now hastily packing their briefcases and rushing toward the elevators, practically sprinting to distance themselves from a man who had just been publicly linked to cartel debts and federal audits. I walked out of the courtroom with my head held high, my attorney Sarah right beside me. We had barely taken 5 steps down the polished marble corridor before my mother Rosalind intercepted us. She moved with a terrifying speed, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the stone floor. Before I could even brace myself, her hand lashed out. The sharp, stinging crack of her palm striking my left cheek echoed loudly down the entire length of the hallway, causing bystanders and court clerks to stop and stare. "You vindictive, ungrateful liar!" Rosalind screamed, her voice completely devoid of the refined country club elegance she usually projected. "How dare you fabricate that audio? How dare you create a deep-fake recording to destroy this family? Trent is a good man. He is the savior of this family. He funds our entire lifestyle and keeps your father's business afloat. You are so violently jealous of your sister's perfect marriage that you would commit perjury just to ruin them." I did not touch my cheek. I did not rub the stinging red mark she had just left on my skin. I simply looked at the woman who had birthed me, feeling a profound and hollow sadness that she was willing to violently defend a white man who was actively destroying her legacy instead of protecting her own daughter. "You really believe I faked that voicemail, Mom?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level so the surrounding audience could hear my absolute sanity. "You would rather believe that I am a criminal mastermind capable of fabricating complex digital audio than accept the simple fact that the man you worship is a degenerate fraud." Trent pushed his way past my mother, his face a terrifying shade of crimson. The polite progressive facade he wore for the wealthy black elites of Atlanta had completely evaporated. He crowded into my personal space, using his tall frame to trap me against the cold marble wall of the hallway. He leaned down, his breath hot and ragged, reeking of the mints he constantly chewed to hide his nerves. "You think you won something in there, you pathetic nobody?" Trent hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper meant only for my ears. "You think a single out-of-context voicemail is going to stop me? I am an investment banker. I control accounts you cannot even comprehend. I have a team of corporate lawyers who will tie you up in endless litigation. I will personally ensure that every single asset you possess is frozen. I will bury you in so many legal fees and court dates that you will be living on the street. You will be crawling on your hands and knees, begging me to take that kid just so you can afford to eat." He glared down at me, fully expecting me to cower. He expected the weight of his white privilege and his enormous corporate power to crush my spirit. He truly believed that because he wore a custom-tailored suit and worked on Wall Street, he was an untouchable god among my family of social climbers. I looked up at him and I did something that completely broke his brain. I laughed. It was not a nervous giggle or a hysterical sound. It was a deep, genuine, and completely relaxed laugh that bubbled up from the bottom of my chest. Trent's eyes widened in genuine confusion as I easily ducked under his arm and stepped away from the wall, neutralizing his physical intimidation tactic. "You really believe your own hype? Do not you, Trent?" I said, projecting my voice, so my mother and my father could hear every single word. You think, because you are a white man in a custom suit, my family worships you as their ultimate savior. And the saddest part is that they actually do. They let you sit at our dinner table and make snide racial microaggressions because they are so desperate for proximity to your wealth. They sold their own souls and tried to sell my son just to keep you happy. But you made a massive miscalculation about me and the man I married. Calvin stepped forward, his chest heaving as he tried to regain control of his imploding family. Your husband was a common laborer, Corinne Calvin barked desperately, trying to maintain his authority. He poured concrete. He was a nobody who brought nothing but shame to our lineage. Do not you dare compare him to a financial executive. I turned my gaze to my father, feeling the last fragile thread of my respect for him snap completely. He did pour concrete, Dad, I replied. He started his company with a single cement mixer and calloused hands. But he was not just a construction worker. He was a visionary real estate developer. While you were spending your money on country club memberships and leased luxury cars, my husband was buying up neglected industrial lots across downtown Atlanta. You called him a nobody, but you never bothered to look at his actual business portfolio. I turned my attention back to Trent, who was suddenly looking remarkably sick. I took a slow step toward him, forcing him to back up. Do you know who owns the commercial land beneath the massive glass skyscraper where your investment banking firm is headquartered? Trent? I asked, my voice echoing off the marble walls. Do you know who owns the master lease for that entire city block? Trent swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically to his left and right. My late husband owned that land, Trent, I stated, watching the absolute shock register on his pale face. He bought that dirt for pennies 10 years ago. When your prestigious Wall Street firm wanted to build their southern headquarters, they had to sign a 99-year ground lease with his holding company. My husband, the common laborer you all mocked, was your firm's landlord. And when he died, that entire holding company and every single one of those commercial leases transferred directly into a blind trust for my son Malik. My mother let out a small choked gasp, grabbing onto my father's arm for physical support. They had spent years treating my husband like dirt on their shoes, completely unaware that he possessed more generational wealth than their entire social circle combined. But that is not even the best part. Trent, I continued, unzipping my structured leather tote bag. You told me you would bury me in legal fees. You told me you controlled the accounts, but you forgot who you were talking to. I am a forensic accountant. I do not just look at spreadsheets, I dissect them. I strip them down to their core algorithms, and I find the hidden arteries where rats like you siphon the blood. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick stack of printed bank statements, bound tightly with a heavy rubber band. I held the stack up in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the courthouse hallway. Trent's eyes locked onto the papers like a man staring at his own execution warrant. When I realized you and Brianna were desperately trying to steal Malik's trust fund, I had to ask myself why a highly successful investment banker would need to steal from an 8-year-old child. I explained, my voice steady and relentless. So I started digging into your offshore corporate structures. It was incredibly sloppy work, Trent. You set up a series of shell companies in the British Virgin Islands to hide the catastrophic losses you were taking on aggressive margin calls. You hemorrhaged $30 million of your clients' money, and you thought you could replace it before the SEC regulators noticed. Trent's breathing became erratic. He reached out a trembling hand as if he wanted to snatch the documents from me, but my attorney Sarah stepped smoothly between us. But you did not just steal from your wealthy corporate clients, did you? Trent? I pressed, watching his entire life flash before his panicked eyes. When the cartel margin calls started coming due, you needed liquid cash immediately. You could not wait for the complex wire transfers to clear. So you went looking for easy money. Money that was managed by people who trusted you implicitly. People who gave you absolute power over their financial portfolios because they thought you were their white knight. I turned to look at my parents. Calvin was staring at Trent with a look of dawning horror. Rosalind was shaking her head in violent denial, refusing to process the words coming out of my mouth. I handed the thick stack of bank statements directly to my father. Calvin looked down at the top page, and his breath hitched loudly in his throat. I tracked exactly where you have been hiding the money, Trent, I said, my voice dropping to a cold, clinical register. I followed the wire transfers from the domestic accounts to the offshore holding companies. I watched you systematically drain every single penny from Calvin and Rosalind's retirement accounts. I tracked how you liquidated their stock portfolios, how you secretly remortgaged their pristine Atlanta estate, and how you completely emptied the college funds they set up for Brianna's non-existent future children. My father let out a sound that was halfway between a sob and a scream. He flipped frantically through the pages, staring at the highlighted routing numbers and the zero balances on accounts he thought held millions. The wealth he had spent 40 years building, the money he used to secure his elite status in society, was completely gone. "You are broke, Trent," I said, watching the arrogant investment banker physically crumble against the courthouse wall. "You do not have the money to bury me in legal fees. You do not have the money to pay off the people who are coming to break your legs. You are entirely bankrupt." I looked at my mother, whose face was streaked with running mascara as she stared at the financial documents in her husband's trembling hands. And so are they. The silence that followed was apocalyptic. It was the sound of a carefully manufactured dynasty crashing into absolute ruin. My parents had sacrificed their morals, their daughter and their grandson, to protect their status and their money. And now, standing in the cold hallway of the family court, they realized they had handed their entire kingdom over to a predator who had stripped them bare. Trent slid slowly down the marble wall until he was sitting on the floor, his head buried in his hands. He was a ruined man waiting for the federal agents to arrive. My father dropped the bank statements and they scattered across the floor like dead leaves. I stood there looking at the devastating wreckage of my bloodline, feeling no pity and no remorse. I had only delivered the truth, and the truth had set me free. I turned to my lawyer, Sarah, and nodded toward the exit. "We are done here," I said. "Let them choke on it." I turned my back on my weeping parents and the shattered investment banker, walking away down the long corridor without ever looking back. I had a son to pick up and a beautiful life to continue living, far away from the toxic ashes of their ruined excellence. But as I pushed through the heavy glass exit doors of the courthouse, my phone vibrated sharply in my pocket. It was an automated alert from my secure server. A new unauthorized login attempt had just been detected on the fake trust fund portal. Trent was sitting on the floor in the hallway, entirely broken. So who was trying to access the money now? I looked back through the glass doors and saw my mother, Rosalind, pulling her phone from her designer purse, her eyes scanning the screen with a sudden frantic desperation. They were completely broke, but the greed was still alive and kicking. The real war was just beginning. I stepped out into the warm Atlanta sunlight, the heat wrapping around me like a protective cloak. My mother had just discovered she was destitute, and instead of turning her anger toward the man who stole from her, she was still trying to steal from her own grandson to save herself. I unlocked my car and slid into the driver's seat, pulling up the tracking software on my encrypted laptop. "She took the bait," I whispered to myself, watching the digital footprints illuminate on the screen. "Let us see how far down the rabbit hole you are truly willing to go, Mother." I started the engine, the low rumble vibrating through the steering wheel as I prepared to initiate the next phase of their absolute destruction. I had torn down the White Knight, but the Queen still thought she had a move left to play. I pulled out of the courthouse parking lot, heading straight toward the eye of the storm, ready to burn the rest of their kingdom to the ground. Let the games begin. I had barely pulled my car out of the courthouse parking spot when two massive white utility vans suddenly swerved directly into my path. They blocked the exit entirely and forced my foot to slam violently onto the brakes. The tires squealed against the hot asphalt as my car jerked to a sudden halt. Before I could even reach for the gear shift to throw the car into reverse, the heavy metal doors of both vans flew wide open. Four large men dressed in pristine white orderly uniforms rushed out into the bright morning sunlight. They were carrying a heavy medical stretcher equipped with thick leather restraints. They moved with terrifying military precision directly toward my vehicle. Behind them, Trent stepped out of the deep shadows of the courthouse portico. He was no longer the broken and weeping man sitting on the hallway floor. He was a cornered and desperate animal who had just called in his final corrupt favor to save his own life. He walked aggressively up to my car window and slapped a folded piece of paper against the glass. I could clearly read the bold black lettering at the top of the page. It was a psychiatric hold of 5/15/50 order. It was signed by a corrupt county judge, and it was formally authorized by Brianna's medical license. The sheer depth of the systemic rot within this city was absolutely staggering. My family had mobilized their wealth and their elite connections to completely bypass the law. Trent sneered, and his hot breath fogged the glass of my window. "Welcome to the real world, sweetheart," he shouted through the thick barrier. "I own the judge." I realized in that terrifying and absolute instant that my family had entirely corrupted the local legal system. They were actually going to abduct me in broad daylight and lock me away in a secure mental asylum. They were going to drug me into submission just to gain permanent control of my son's massive trust fund. They would stop at nothing to pay off the cartel and save their pristine country club reputations. The orderlies did not wait for me to open the door. They began smashing the windows of my car with heavy metal batons. The reinforced glass spider-webbed and shattered inward. Sharp glittering shards sprayed across my lap and embedded themselves into the leather seats. I knew I could not sit there and let them drag me out like a helpless victim. I waited for the closest orderly to swing his baton again, and then I kicked the driver's side door open with all my physical strength. The heavy metal door caught the massive man right in the chest. The impact knocked the wind out of him and sent him stumbling backward onto the hard asphalt. I scrambled out of the vehicle, and my adrenaline spiked as rough hands immediately grabbed at my jacket. I fought them off with absolute feral desperation. I refused to let my son grow up without a mother, just so these monsters could maintain their fake wealth. I swung my heavy leather tote bag upward with brutal force. The solid brass hardware on the bottom of the bag smashed directly into the face of the second orderly. He cursed loudly and grabbed his bleeding nose, giving me the briefest fraction of a second to escape their grip. I knew I could not outrun 4 grown men in an open and flat parking lot, so I sprinted directly back up the wide marble steps of the courthouse. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and threw myself back into the oppressive air of the main lobby. The security guards standing near the metal detectors moved to intercept me, but I bypassed them completely. I dove toward the main fire alarm pull station mounted on the far lobby wall. I smashed the protective glass cover with my elbow, ignoring the sharp sting of cutting my own skin. I grabbed the red lever and pulled it downward with all my remaining strength. Instantly, the entire massive courthouse erupted into absolute and deafening chaos. High-pitched sirens blared continuously through the building, and intense strobe lights flashed blindingly against the polished stone walls. Hundreds of panicked lawyers, court clerks, and bewildered civilians flooded out of the courtrooms. They completely clogged the main lobby in a desperate rush to evacuate the building. The massive crowd of frightened and confused people acted as a perfect human shield between me and the pursuing orderlies. I slipped into the dense throngs of people, ducking my head and moving swiftly toward the restricted emergency stairwell at the back of the massive building. The orderlies were completely trapped behind a thick wall of screaming civilians and shouting security guards. They could not reach me without causing a massive public scene. I pushed my way through the heavy fire doors and stepped into the dark and echoey concrete stairwell. The alarm sirens were slightly muffled by the thick concrete walls, but the flashing lights still penetrated the gloom through small glass viewports. I bounded down the concrete steps, taking them 2 at a time, and desperately trying to reach the subterranean exit before the entire building went into full automated lockdown. My breathing was ragged and my legs burned with the intense physical exertion. I could hear the heavy boots of the orderlies somewhere far above me echoing down the central shaft of the stairwell. I knew I only had seconds to disappear into the city streets. But as I rounded the landing between the second and first floors, a lone figure stepped out from the deep shadows and completely blocked my only path to freedom. It was Brianna. She was severely out of breath, and her expensive designer silk dress was visibly torn at the hem. Her perfect makeup was smeared, and her eyes were blazing with an absolute and unhinged malice. That intense look completely stripped away every single ounce of her refined surgical persona. She spread her arms wide and pressed her back against the heavy metal exit door, refusing to let me pass. She had always been entirely willing to do the absolute dirtiest work when the family legacy was on the line, and today was clearly no different. She was a woman who was absolutely desperate to save the only life she knew how to live. "You are not going anywhere, Corinne," she hissed loudly over the rhythmic blaring of the alarm sirens. "You are going to turn around and walk back upstairs and get into that ambulance. You are going to sign over that money to Trent right now because you owe us. You have always owed us everything we ever gave you. We are the ones who matter in this family. We are the ones who carry the legacy of excellence. You are nothing but a common laborer's wife, and you do not deserve to hold our entire future hostage." I did not stop moving forward. I marched straight down the concrete steps until I was standing mere inches from her sweating face. I could see the desperate fear hiding just behind her aggressive anger. The sheer raw truth I was about to deliver to her was far more lethal than any physical weapon those orderlies could have carried. I looked directly into the dark eyes of the older sister who had ruthlessly tried to drug me and murder me and steal my only child for her own selfish gain. "You always hated me, Brianna," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of any remaining sibling affection. My words cut through the noise of the blaring alarms with absolute icy precision. "You spent your entire life trying to tear me down because you could not stand the simple fact that I was genuinely happy without needing your approval. You hate me because despite your prestigious medical degree and your massive estate and your rich white husband, you are entirely barren. You could never give Trent the biological heir he constantly demanded, and you decided that stealing my son was the only way to secure your miserable, loveless marriage. And now, thanks to Trent and his massive illegal gambling debts, you are also completely bankrupt. You have absolutely nothing left, Brianna. Your money is gone. Your reputation is destroyed. Your medical license will be revoked by tomorrow morning when the hospital board audits that missing surgical anesthetic. You are a failure in every single way that actually matters." The brutal and unflinching reality of my words slammed into her like a physical blow. The absolute truth shattered the final remaining pieces of her heavily constructed reality. Her arms slowly dropped to her sides, and her face contorted in an expression of absolute agonizing defeat. The shiny illusion of her perfect and superior life had been completely destroyed, and she finally realized she had absolutely nothing left to fight for. The power she thought she held over me was completely gone. I stepped forcefully past her frozen and trembling body and shoved the heavy metal exit door open with my shoulder. She did not even try to stop me. She just stood there, in the flashing red light, sobbing into her hands. I burst out into the back alley of the courthouse, and the humid Atlanta air hit me like a solid, comforting wall. An unmarked black SUV was idling quietly near the industrial dumpsters at the very edge of the alley. Its dark-tinted windows began rolling down smoothly as I approached the massive vehicle. I recognized the man sitting in the driver's seat instantly. It was the taller police officer from Trent's living room the night before. But he was no longer wearing his standard local police uniform. He was dressed in a dark, unmarked tactical suit. He flashed a federal badge at me and gave me a sharp and highly professional nod. He was an undercover FBI agent who had been embedded in the local precinct for months, specifically to investigate the widespread corruption surrounding Trent's illegal corporate dealings and the dirty judges on his massive payroll. He had been quietly monitoring Trent's movements and my family's involvement in the attempted fraud. I climbed into the passenger seat and slammed the heavy armored door shut. The thick ballistic glass completely locked out the wailing sirens and the chaotic reality of my family's total public destruction. The cool air conditioning washed over my sweating face as I opened my encrypted laptop and rested it gently on my knees. I looked at the federal agent and let out a long, slow breath of absolute relief. My son was safe, and the monsters who had tried to consume our lives were finally facing the devastating consequences of their own boundless greed. They took the bait, I said calmly, watching the digital tracking software illuminate on my screen and lock onto the offshore accounts. Let us initiate phase 2. We drove in absolute silence through the winding streets of downtown Atlanta, leaving the screaming chaos of the courthouse and my shattered family far behind us. The unmarked black SUV glided smoothly into the dark underground parking garage of an unassuming federal building. I stepped out of the heavy armored vehicle and followed the undercover agent down a long, fluorescent-lit corridor until we reached a thick steel door. He swiped his federal keycard, and the heavy deadbolts clicked open, revealing the buzzing, highly secured FBI safe house that had been my secret sanctuary for the past 6 months. The room was massive and freezing cold, filled with endless rows of humming servers and glowing computer monitors. Dozens of federal agents moved efficiently through the space, tracking global financial networks and building airtight cases against corporate predators. I walked over to my designated workstation and opened my encrypted laptop, plugging it directly into the federal mainframe. The undercover police officer, whose real name was Special Agent Marcus, pulled up a chair beside me and handed me a steaming cup of black coffee. We had been working together intimately ever since I first discovered the glaring discrepancies in Trent's offshore accounts half a year ago. When I initially approached the bureau with my findings, they were stunned by the sheer volume of illicit money Trent was moving for the cartel. They needed a highly skilled inside man to map the exact digital infrastructure of his operation, and I was the perfect Trojan horse. Marcus looked at the live feed of Trent's domestic accounts on the main screen and then looked over at me with a lingering question in his eyes. He crossed his arms over his dark tactical vest and studied my face. "You had the toxicology report linking Brianna directly to the paralyzing agent," he said, his voice echoing slightly over the low hum of the servers. "You knew for an absolute fact that your mother handed you the poisoned tea and your sister supplied the hospital-grade drugs. We could have arrested all of them for attempted murder right there in the courthouse hallway. Why did you hold back on pressing violent criminal charges, Corinne?" I took a slow sip of the bitter coffee and stared at the glowing green lines of code cascading down my monitor. "Marcus, you saw what happened in that hallway, before those orderlies attacked me," I explained, my voice cold and analytical. "When I showed my parents the bank statements proving Trent had embezzled their entire life savings to cover his bad investments, they did not turn on him." My own mother slapped me across the face. She looked at me with absolute hatred and demanded that I hand over Malik's trust fund to Trent voluntarily. She actually said we have to protect Trent, because if he goes down, the scandal will ruin our family, and we will be kicked out of the country club. She drugged me and left me for dead in the Appalachian Mountains just to steal my son's money to pay off a white man's debt. She was willing to let me die just to save her prestigious country club membership. And when I refused, my father signaled his lawyer and slapped me with a fake psychiatric hold, signed by a corrupt judge ordering me to be committed to a mental asylum immediately. Attempted murder in a remote wilderness is incredibly hard to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt. I continued tapping a key on my laptop to bring up the master financial ledger. Brianna is a wealthy Ivy League surgeon with a pristine public record and a team of ruthless defense attorneys. My father has judges and local prosecutors eating out of the palm of his hand. If we charged them with attempted murder, they would have spun it as a tragic misunderstanding. They would have claimed the tea was just a holistic sleep aid and that I accidentally ingested the surgical anesthetic somewhere else. They would have dragged the court case out for years and kept their elite status perfectly intact while painting me as a hysterical, grieving widow looking for someone to blame. I set the coffee cup down and let my fingers hover over the keyboard. But financial fraud across state lines leaves a permanent and undeniable digital footprint, I said, watching the screen blink as new data packets arrived. "Numbers do not lie, Marcus, and numbers do not care about country club memberships or generational wealth." My family tried to kill me because they worship money and status above human life. Putting them in a sterile jail cell for a few years was never going to be enough. I wanted them to completely lose the only things they actually care about. I wanted to burn their kingdom down to the roots and let them feel the absolute terror of being poor and powerless. Marcus nodded slowly, finally understanding the sheer depth and patience of my strategy. To catch a greedy predator, you have to offer them a meal they simply cannot resist, I said, bringing up the heavily monitored portal for my son's $50 million trust fund. The money my late husband left for Malik was secured behind layers of complex legal trusts, but I intentionally left a single digital backdoor wide open. I knew Trent was drowning in cartel debt and desperate for a massive influx of untraceable cash. I purposely let my family believe that the trust fund was entirely unguarded and that I was too mentally unstable to manage it. I played the role of the broken widow perfectly because I needed them to take the bait. I needed Trent to reach his greedy hands into a federally monitored account and commit federal wire fraud right in front of the entire United States government. The safe house was quiet, except for the low hum of the servers and the rapid clicking of my keyboard. We watched the screens intently waiting for the final piece of the trap to snap shut. Trent had just suffered the ultimate public humiliation in the courthouse hallway. He knew his domestic accounts were empty, and he knew the violent cartel was rapidly closing in on him. He was a cornered rat, and cornered rats always make fatal, desperate mistakes. Suddenly, the main monitor flashed with a bright red alert banner. A secure ping echoed through the quiet room, drawing the attention of several other agents who gathered behind us. Marcus sat up straight and pointed at the scrolling transaction log. "There it is," Marcus said, his voice tight with anticipation. "Trent just initiated the wire transfer. He is using his executive overrides to bypass the standard banking protocols. He is trying to route the entire $50 million trust fund out of the domestic holding account and dump it straight into his offshore Cayman shell company." I watched the progress bar inching across the screen. Trent was moving so fast he was leaving a digital trail a mile wide. The federal servers were instantly capturing his IP address, his device identifiers, and his unauthorized digital signatures. He was wrapping a federal indictment tightly around his own neck with every single keystroke. But as I monitored the routing pathway, something highly unusual flashed across the secondary screen. A conflicting access protocol popped up attempting to override Trent's primary transfer command. Marcus frowned and leaned closer to the monitor, tracing the new line of malicious code with his index finger. "What is happening here, Corinne?" he asked, sounding genuinely confused. "The transfer is experiencing a hostile reroute. Someone else is inside the secure server network, simultaneously initiating a secondary wire transfer for the exact same $50 million. I watched the competing IP addresses battle for control of the massive fortune, and a dark, knowing smile spread across my face. I traced the secondary access point, recognizing the distinct digital signature immediately. It was not the cartel, and it was not one of Trent's corporate accomplices. It was a private server located directly inside my parents' Buckhead estate. My mother had stood in that courthouse hallway and violently defended the man who robbed her. She had slapped my face and called me a liar because she was so terrified of losing her social standing. But the moment I handed her the undeniable proof that Trent was bankrupt, her loyalty completely evaporated. She did not care about family, and she certainly did not care about Brianna's marriage. She only cared about her own survival. She must have rushed straight back to the Buckhead estate while the orderlies were chasing me through the lobby. She logged into my father's secure terminal and used the exact same backdoor access they had all prepared for Trent. But instead of routing the money to the Caymans to pay off the cartel, she was redirecting the massive fortune into her own hidden private accounts. She was actively throwing Trent to the wolves to save her own skin. "There is a problem," Marcus said, watching the numbers rapidly shift on the screen as the two competing transfers collided in the mainframe. "Trent is trying to move your son's trust fund into his offshore account, but someone else is actively trying to steal it from him right under his nose." I leaned back in my chair and took another sip of coffee, relishing the absolute poetry of their mutual destruction. "It is my mother," I said softly. Rosalind realized Trent embezzled her life savings, so now she is hijacking his illegal wire transfer. She is stealing her own grandson's trust fund to save herself. The federal agents standing behind me watched the screens in stunned silence. They had spent their entire careers tracking hardened criminals and violent syndicates, but the sheer ruthless greed of my high society family was something entirely different. They were watching a mother cannibalize her own children and her own grandson just to maintain a fragile illusion of wealth. The two unauthorized transfers clashed violently within the banking mainframe. Trent was trying to force the transaction through from a compromised mobile device, while my mother was using a hardwired connection from the estate. The federal servers easily quarantined both requests, locking the $50 million safely inside a frozen escrow account, while simultaneously generating two separate arrest warrants. Marcus let out a low whistle of disbelief. "They really are eating each other alive," he said, shaking his head. "Trent is going to face federal wire fraud charges, and your mother is going to be indicted for cyber theft and conspiracy. They just handed us the entire case on a silver platter." I closed my encrypted laptop and the glowing screen faded to black. They thought I was weak because I chose a simple life over their toxic ambition, I said, standing up from the workstation. They thought my husband was a nobody, and they thought my son was just a pawn they could sacrifice to pay their debts. But they never understood that the loudest people in the room are always the most fragile. They built their entire kingdom on lies and stolen money, and now they are going to spend the rest of their lives locked in federal prison, wondering how the family disappointment managed to take them all down. I sat in the freezing FBI safe house watching the high-definition security feed broadcast across the massive federal monitors. I had compromised the internal network of my parents' Buckhead estate months ago, using a simple phishing email that my father had foolishly clicked on. Marcus stood behind my shoulder, his arms crossed over his dark tactical vest, as we watched the absolute carnage unfold in real time inside my father's luxurious mahogany home office. The hidden security cameras captured every single desperate movement in crisp, brilliant color. The federal agents surrounding me were completely silent, absolutely captivated by the horrific reality television show playing out on the glowing screens. We had successfully locked the $50 million trust fund in a frozen federal escrow account, but the people inside that mansion did not know that yet. They still thought they were fighting over a massive pile of unguarded cash. Calvin and Rosalind were completely panicked. My father was sitting in Trent's expensive imported leather desk chair, sweating so profusely that his expensive dress shirt was clinging to his back. My mother was leaning heavily over his shoulder, her manicured fingers digging viciously into his arm. They had somehow bypassed Trent's physical security and stolen his encrypted master password ledger from a hidden safe. They were desperately typing sequences of numbers into the terminal, trying to reroute Malik's trust fund into their own private offshore accounts before the federal government could freeze it and before Trent could steal it back for the cartel. They were completely feral with greed. They looked like starving animals fighting over a scrap of meat, entirely forgetting that the meat belonged to their own flesh and blood. The heavy oak doors of the office suddenly burst open and slammed violently against the wall. Trent stormed into the room, his custom suit wrinkled and his face completely twisted with an unhinged rage. He had just fled the courthouse parking lot after realizing his corrupt orderlies had failed to capture me. He had rushed back to the estate to finish his offshore transfer and flee the country, but he was too late. He saw my parents hunched over his laptop, and he absolutely snapped. He lunged across the room with terrifying speed and shoved Calvin hard against the heavy wooden desk. He ripped the laptop away and stared at the screen, realizing exactly what they were trying to do. The polite progressive facade he wore for the Atlanta elite completely evaporated in a single second. He started screaming at them, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the home office. He dropped every single ounce of his carefully curated woke persona. He looked at my parents with absolute disgust and pure, unadulterated hatred. "You pathetic, begging social climbers!" Trent screamed, his face turning a violent shade of purple. You actually thought you were my equals. You thought because you bought a massive house in a white neighborhood and leased German luxury cars that you were playing on my level. You are nothing but cheap imitations of real wealth. You are absolute frauds. I let you sit at my dinner table and drink my expensive wine because it amused me to watch you pretend. You were so desperate for my proximity, so hungry for white corporate validation, that you literally sold your own daughter to the slaughterhouse without a second thought. You helped me steal from your own grandson because you are terrified of going back to the poor working-class neighborhoods you crawled out of. Calvin backed away, holding his hands up defensively. Rosalind was shaking uncontrollably, her pristine country club elegance completely shattered by the vile reality of Trent's words. They had worshipped this man as a god, and now he was looking at them like they were insects. You sold your own flesh and blood for a country club membership. Trent laughed, a harsh and vicious sound that echoed through the room. You drug your own daughter and left her to die in the woods just to keep your pathetic social standing intact. You disgust me. You are nothing but desperate, greedy animals. You let me drain your entire retirement accounts because you were too stupid and too arrogant to ever question a white man in a custom suit. You handed me the keys to your entire lives because you wanted to feel important. And now you are trying to steal from me. You do not even have the intelligence to execute a simple wire transfer without triggering a security protocol. Brianna walked into the office just as Trent was delivering his most vicious and racist insults. She stood in the doorway, completely frozen in her torn designer dress. She listened to the man she worshipped tear her entire family to shreds with racial slurs and classist venom. She had spent her entire adult life trying to be the perfect elite wife, catering to his every single demand and ignoring his glaring flaws. She had betrayed me and actively tried to destroy my life just to protect her marriage to this man. Trent did not stop or apologize when he saw her standing there. He was entirely unhinged by the looming threat of the cartel and the federal authorities. He turned his venom directly on his wife. He laughed in her face, and the sound was completely devoid of any affection or warmth. Look at the brilliant surgeon, Trent mocked, gesturing wildly toward Brianna. Look at the golden child of the family. You really thought I loved you, Brianna. You thought I married you because you were special. You were nothing but a convenient diversity prop for my corporate portfolio. I needed a beautiful, highly educated black wife to make me look progressive to my wealthy liberal investors. You were a strategic business decision and a tax write-off. You made me look like the ultimate progressive savior while I was secretly laundering money right under your perfect little nose. Brianna's jaw trembled as the absolute truth washed over her. She stared at Trent as if she was seeing him for the very first time. The protective veil of denial was completely ripped away. And you could not even give me an heir. Trent continued, stepping closer to her and delivering the final crushing blow. I spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on your useless fertility treatments, and you are completely barren. You are an empty vessel, Brianna. You failed as a wife, and you failed as a woman. The only reason I kept you around was to get my hands on your sister's kid. I needed a biological asset to secure my family trust, and you were too broken to provide one. You are completely useless to me now that the money is gone. I sat in the safe house and watched my older sister shatter into a million jagged pieces. Everything she had sacrificed, her morals, her sister, her nephew, her own basic human decency, was for a man who viewed her as a prop. She had destroyed her own soul to build a dynasty with a man who secretly hated her and her entire race. The shiny illusion of her perfect and superior life was completely obliterated. She realized in that exact moment that she was entirely bankrupt, both financially and morally. She had nothing left to lose and nothing left to protect. Brianna did not scream and she did not cry. A terrifying and completely detached calm settled over her features. She walked slowly into the room, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. She moved with the cold, clinical precision of a surgeon stepping up to an operating table. She walked past my mother, who was weeping hysterically near the bookshelves. She walked past my father, who was staring at the floor in absolute defeat. She walked directly toward my father's heavy mahogany desk. Calvin always kept a registered firearm locked in the bottom right drawer of his desk. He kept it there because despite his massive wealth and his gated community, he was deeply paranoid about losing his material possessions. Brianna knew exactly where the key was hidden under the heavy brass inkwell. Trent was still ranting, completely oblivious to the shift in the room. He was frantically typing on the laptop again, desperately trying to force the offshore wire transfer through the frozen federal escrow system. He cursed loudly at the screen, slamming his hand against the keyboard. Brianna opened the bottom drawer of the desk and reached inside. She pulled the heavy black pistol from the shadows. The polished metal gleamed under the warm office lights. She gripped the weapon with both hands and racked the slide with a loud, sharp metallic click that instantly silenced the entire room. The sound echoed off the walls like a thunderclap. Trent froze, his hands hovering over the keyboard. He turned his head slowly, and the arrogant sneer completely vanished from his face. The color drained from his cheeks as he stared down the barrel of the loaded weapon. Brianna raised the pistol and pointed it directly at Trent's chest. Her hands were perfectly steady. There was no hesitation and no fear in her dark eyes. The golden child was finally performing a procedure she could not fix with money or prestige. She was looking at the disease that had infected her entire life, and she was preparing to cut it out. "Step away from the computer!" Brianna commanded, her voice completely dead and devoid of any emotion. "Step away right now before I end your miserable, pathetic life." Trent slowly raised his hands in the air, backing away from the desk. His chest was heaving with sudden blind panic. "Brianna, honey, let us think about this," he stammered, his voice trembling and weak. "You do not want to do this. You are a doctor. You save lives. We can fix this. We can still get the money and leave. We can start over somewhere else." "You do not get to speak to me anymore," Brianna said, stepping closer and keeping the gun leveled directly at his heart. "You do not get to use my name. You took everything from me. You made me a monster. You made me betray my own sister." I leaned forward in my chair at the FBI safe house. Marcus placed a hand on my shoulder, signaling that the tactical teams were already in position outside the estate, waiting for the final command to breach the doors. But I needed to look them in the eyes one last time. I needed them to know exactly who had orchestrated their total destruction. The time for hiding in the shadows and playing the victim was completely over. I was the architect of their ruin, and I wanted them to see my face as their kingdom burned to ash. I typed a rapid sequence of override commands into my federal terminal. I bypassed their local security network and hijacked the massive flat-screen television mounted on the dark wood-paneled wall of my father's office. I routed my laptop camera directly into their smart home system, forcing the feed to broadcast at maximum volume. The huge television screen above the fireplace flickered violently, emitting a loud burst of static that made everyone in the room jump. Trent spun around, and Brianna instinctively tightened her grip on the pistol. Calvin and Rosalind looked up in sheer terror. The static cleared, and the high-definition image stabilized. My face appeared on the massive screen, projecting live into the room. I looked down at the shattered remains of my family and the corrupt investment banker who had tried to steal my son. I was sitting in a secure federal facility, surrounded by agents and holding all the strings to their future. They all stared at the screen in absolute horrified silence. The gun in Brianna's hand wavered slightly as she realized I was watching them live. Trent's jaw dropped open as he finally comprehended the magnitude of the trap he had walked into. I had not just escaped the courthouse. I had been watching them this entire time. I looked at Trent and gave him a slow and chilling smile. "You really should have checked your network security, Trent," I said, my voice booming through the hidden surround sound speakers in the office. "You thought you were stealing unguarded money, but you just authorized a $50 million wire fraud on a federally monitored server. The FBI has everything. They have your cartel connections, your offshore accounts, and your forged signatures. And Brianna, before you pull that trigger, you should know that federal agents have the entire house surrounded. There is absolutely nowhere left to run." The reality of their absolute and inescapable destruction finally settled over the room. The game was over, and I had won. I looked through the camera lens at the 4 people who had made my entire life a living hell. Brianna was still holding the heavy black pistol perfectly level with Trent's chest, but her hands were starting to shake uncontrollably. Trent was staring at my face on the massive screen, with his mouth hanging wide open like a fish gasping for air. My mother Rosalind had collapsed onto the expensive Persian rug, weeping into her hands, while my father Calvin stood completely paralyzed by the heavy wooden desk. They looked absolutely pathetic. I leaned forward in my chair at the federal safe house, making sure my face filled the entire monitor in their luxurious office. "Put the gun down, Brianna," I commanded, my voice echoing loudly through the surround sound speakers. "You do not need to shoot him because he is already a dead man walking." I watched her slowly lower the weapon, her eyes wide with absolute disbelief. She dropped the heavy pistol onto the floor, and it landed with a dull thud against the thick carpet. Trent finally found his voice, his chest heaving as he tried to regain his arrogant posture. He pointed a trembling finger at the screen. "You cannot do this, Corinne," he shouted, his voice cracking with wild panic. "You do not have the clearance or the intelligence to bypass my security networks. You are just a pathetic widow trying to play games you do not understand." I let out a deep and genuine laugh that bounced off the mahogany walls of the room. "You still think you are the smartest person in the room, Trent?" I said, shaking my head slowly. "You think you are a genius investment banker who can outsmart everyone. But you never actually understood how forensic accounting works. Every single password you thought you cleverly hid in that safe was entirely compromised. I planted those passwords there 6 months ago. Every digital document you accessed, every offshore routing number you set up, they were all federal honeypots, designed specifically to track your illegal movements." I watched the color completely drain from his face as the reality of his situation began to sink in. "I worked with the FBI to build a digital labyrinth." I continued, my voice calm and relentlessly clinical. "I knew you were embezzling from your clients to pay the cartel. I knew my own family drugged me in the woods and left me for dead. I knew you all wanted Malik's trust fund to save yourselves. So I purposely let you believe that the $50 million account was completely unguarded. I baited the trap with the one thing you care about more than human life, and you walked right into the center of the maze like a blind rat looking for cheese." I shifted my gaze on the screen to look directly at my father. Calvin flinched as if I had physically struck him. "You and Mom thought you were so incredibly clever stealing his master ledger," I said, watching my parents cower under my virtual gaze. "You thought you could hack into his system and siphon my son's money for yourselves before he could send it to the cartel. You actually believed you were sophisticated thieves, but you were just playing right into my hands. I needed multiple access points to trigger the federal wire fraud alerts, and you two greedy monsters happily provided the secondary breach. You completely incriminated yourselves just to steal from an 8-year-old boy." My father tried to speak, but only a pathetic croaking sound came out of his mouth. He leaned heavily against the desk, looking like a hollow shell of the domineering patriarch he had always pretended to be. "Do you remember what you told me on my college graduation day, Dad?" I asked, letting the years of suppressed anger bleed into my voice. "You refused to attend my ceremony because you said you were too busy entertaining real professionals at the country club. You told me I was a complete failure. You looked at my honors degree in forensic accounting from a state university, and you called it absolute garbage. You said I would never amount to anything because I refused to play your elite social climbing games. You said I brought nothing but shame to the family legacy because I chose a common laborer for a husband instead of a wealthy corporate savior like Trent." Calvin looked down at the floor, unable to meet my eyes through the camera lens. Rosalind sobbed louder, clutching her ruined pearls and rocking back and forth on the expensive rug. "Well, Dad, take a good look around your beautiful home office," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Take a look at your golden child daughter, who just realized her entire marriage was a fake diversity prop for a racist criminal. Take a look at your perfect son-in-law waiting for the cartel to break his legs because he cannot pay his debts. Take a look at your weeping wife, who is about to be indicted for federal cyber theft. Your entire carefully manufactured dynasty is completely in ruins. And it only took this garbage accountant 48 hours to dismantle everything you spent your entire miserable life building. The silence in the room was absolute and suffocating. The federal agent standing behind me in the safe house watched the screens with grim satisfaction. We had them completely cornered, and there was absolutely no way out for any of them. I had waited 6 long months for this exact moment. I had endured their snide comments and their fake pity and their endless microaggressions. I had played the role of the broken and traumatized widow perfectly, never once letting them see the sharp focus in my eyes. I had gathered every shred of digital evidence, every hidden bank statement, and every recorded phone call. I built an invisible cage around them, and they happily locked themselves inside it. Suddenly, Trent spun around and grabbed the laptop from the desk. He was frantically scrolling through the transaction logs, his eyes darting across the screen with renewed manic energy. A sudden, chaotic burst of hysterical laughter erupted from his chest. It was a wild and completely unhinged sound that echoed terribly in the large room. He threw his head back and laughed so hard that tears formed in the corners of his eyes. Brianna took a frightened step backward, keeping her distance from the man she used to call her husband. "You are too late!" Corinne Trent screamed at the screen, a wild and victorious grin spreading across his sweating face. "You think you are so brilliant with your federal traps and your little honeypots, but you are too late." The transfer went through. I bypassed your frozen escrow account and forced the transaction. I have the $50 million. It is completely secured in the Caymans, and there is absolutely nothing you or your little FBI friends can do about it. I win, Corinne. I always win. Welcome to the real world, sweetheart. He slammed his hands down on the desk and glared at the television screen, fully expecting me to scream or cry in defeat. He expected the federal agents behind me to panic. He truly believed he had beaten the system one last time using his superior intellect and his ruthless Wall Street tactics. I did not react to his screaming. I did not show an ounce of fear or disappointment. I just sat there in the cold safe house and smiled at him. It was a slow, chilling smile that completely drained the manic joy right out of his face. "Check the routing number, Trent," I said softly, my voice cutting through his hysterical laughter like a finely sharpened blade. "You did not transfer Malik's money." Trent stopped laughing. The room went dead silent again. He slowly lowered his eyes to the laptop screen. His hands began to shake so violently that he nearly dropped the expensive machine onto the floor. His eyes tracked the long string of numbers on the digital confirmation receipt. "My son's trust fund was never even connected to that portal, Trent," I stated, watching the absolute horror dawn on his pale, sweating face. It was a mirror interface designed to look exactly like the target account. "You were so blinded by your own greed and your panic over the cartel that you did not even verify the origin numbers. You just executed an unauthorized blind transfer of your investment firm's entire master hedge fund." Trent's knees buckled, and he collapsed heavily into the leather chair. His mouth opened and closed, but he could not form a single word. "You stole billions of dollars of your own clients' money." I continued, delivering the final crushing verdict. "And you wired it directly into a frozen federal seizure account. You did not pay the cartel, and you did not secure your freedom. You just handed the FBI every single cent your firm possesses. You are not just a thief anymore, Trent. You are the biggest financial terrorist in the history of Wall Street, and the federal agents are walking through your front door right now." The color drained from Trent's face so fast he looked like a corpse standing in the middle of the room. He stared at the massive television screen where my face was projected, and then looked down at his laptop. His hands hovered over the keyboard, trembling so violently that he could not even press a single key. He tried to hit the escape button, he tried to close the browser, he tried to sever the hardline connection, but it was completely useless. The federal seizure protocol had already locked the terminal. The screen flashed a bright, undeniable federal warning banner indicating that all assets from his hedge fund had been successfully transferred to an FBI escrow account. He let out a sound that was half sob and half scream. He realized in that exact moment that he had just committed a multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud on a traceable server. He had literally stolen billions of dollars from his own wealthy elite clients and handed it directly to the United States government. The cartel was going to hunt him down, and the federal prosecutors were going to bury him under the jail. He fell to his knees on the Persian rug, grasping at his chest as if his heart was giving out. Calvin and Rosalind were backing away from the desk, their eyes wide with absolute horror. My mother was shaking her head back and forth, refusing to believe what she was hearing. My father looked at his own computer terminal, and the horrific realization finally hit him. He had initiated the secondary transfer attempt using his own secure network, his own private internet connection, and his own digital signature. They were not just innocent bystanders watching their son-in-law commit a crime. They were active participants. They were legal accessories to federal wire fraud and cyber theft. Calvin staggered backward and bumped into the mahogany bookshelves, sending several expensive leather-bound volumes crashing to the floor. "What did you do to us, Corinne?" He gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "You ruined us. We are going to lose everything. The house, the accounts, the club. We are going to prison." "I did not do anything to you, Dad," I said, my voice perfectly steady and cold, broadcasting through the speakers. "You did this to yourselves. You were so incredibly blinded by your own toxic greed that you completely abandoned your humanity. You thought you could just drug me in the woods and take my son. You thought you could eliminate me and steal what you believed was rightfully yours." I watched my mother flinch at the mention of the woods. She looked up at the screen, her makeup completely ruined by her tears. "I saw you drink that tea, Corinne," she sobbed hysterically. "I put enough of Brianna's medical-grade paralyzing agent in that cup to drop a horse. I watched you fall asleep. I watched you stop moving in that remote cabin. You should not have survived that. You should have died in those mountains." "You really are pathetic, Mom," I said, leaning closer to the camera so my face filled the entire monitor. "You thought a wealthy socialite with a stolen vial of hospital drugs could take me out in the middle of the wilderness? You thought you could just drive away in your luxury vehicle and let the elements finish the job. But you forgot one very important detail about the man you hated so much. You called my late husband a nobody. You mocked him because he was a park ranger and a wilderness survival instructor instead of a corporate banker. You laughed at his heavy boots and his calloused hands. But the man you laughed at spent 10 years teaching me everything he knew about the deep woods." I watched Brianna look up from the floor, still holding her empty hands in front of her. She was listening intently to every single word I said, her face completely blank with shock. "When my body started going numb in that cabin, I knew exactly what you had done." I explained, my voice echoing in the silent office. "But my husband taught me how to survive when the elite snobs of the world leave you for dead. I knew how to force my body to purge the toxins before they could fully absorb into my bloodstream. I spent hours crawling through the dirt, pulling myself along the forest floor until I could sweat out the chemicals. I knew how to track my way out of the dense Appalachian forest in the dead of night, with no flashlight and no map. I survived because of the exact skills you all deemed worthless and lower class. My husband's knowledge kept me alive, and my forensic accounting degree gave me the tools to completely destroy you." Trent's head snapped up from the floor. He was clutching his hair, his eyes wide and completely feral. The money, he choked out, spitting the words through his teeth. "It does not matter. The trust fund is still out there. The $50 million is still in that account. The cartel will take it. They will take the boy to get to it. We just have to give them the routing numbers for Malik's trust." I looked at the four of them, broken, terrified, and still clinging to the illusion of the massive fortune. I took a slow, deep breath, savoring the absolute perfection of the final blow I was about to deliver. This was the moment I had built the entire operation for. Every late night, coding the honeypots, every fake document I drafted, every breadcrumb I laid out, led to this exact second. "There is no $50 million, Trent," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm whisper that commanded the entire room. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out of the office. Trent stared at the screen, his chest heaving. Calvin and Rosalind froze, completely paralyzed by the words I had just spoken. Brianna slowly stood up, her eyes locked on my face. "What are you talking about?" My father croaked, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "We saw the bank statements. We saw the federal routing numbers. We saw the balance. You saw what I wanted you to see, Dad. I said, a dark smile spreading across my face. My husband was a wonderful man and a dedicated father, but he was a park ranger. He was not a secret billionaire. When he died, he left Malik a standard life insurance policy worth $500,000. That is it. That is the entire fortune. $500,000 sitting safely in a highly secure local credit union, untouched and completely invisible to you. Trent's eyes were bulging out of his skull. He let out a low, guttural sound of pure denial. No, 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 he repeated, rocking back and forth on his knees. That is a lie. The offshore accounts, the federal monitors, the layered trusts. I saw the digital infrastructure. It was flawless. It was flawless because I built it, I replied, leaning back in my chair at the safe house. I fabricated the entire $50 million trust fund. I coded the fake bank statements. I designed the dummy offshore holding accounts and the fake federal escrows. I created a brilliant digital mirage using the very accounting skills you all mocked. I dangled a massive imaginary fortune in front of your faces just to see how far you would go to steal it. I watched the absolute devastating truth wash over my family. They had destroyed their entire lives. They had attempted murder. They had committed massive federal fraud. They had thrown each other to the wolves and shattered their marriages. They had sold their souls to a violent cartel and risked federal prison. And they did it all for a pile of money that literally did not exist. You went all the way to federal prison for a phantom fortune, I said, my voice echoing relentlessly through the mahogany room. You destroyed your entire legacy because you were too greedy to see the trap. You worshipped wealth so blindly that you followed an illusion right off a cliff. You sold your own blood for ghost money. Rosalind let out a piercing, high-pitched scream and collapsed completely onto the floor, burying her face in the rug. She clawed at the expensive fibers, her mind completely unable to process the total destruction of her reality. Calvin grabbed the edge of the desk, his legs finally giving out as he crumpled to his knees beside Trent. He buried his face in his hands, weeping openly for the loss of his country club status and his precious reputation. Brianna just stood there, staring blankly at the wall, her mind completely broken by the sheer magnitude of the deception. They had sacrificed their humanity for absolutely nothing. They were empty, bankrupt shells waiting for the end. Suddenly, a sharp wailing sound pierced the heavy silence of the office. It started faint but rapidly grew louder and more intense. The unmistakable sound of sirens filled the night air outside the Buckhead estate. Through the heavy mahogany blinds, the entire room was suddenly illuminated by brilliant flashes of red and blue light. The piercing strobes bounced off the expensive artwork, and the crystal decanters casting long, terrifying shadows across the walls. The flashing lights painted their horrified faces in shifting colors of crimson and sapphire. The federal authorities had arrived. Trent's head whipped toward the window, his eyes completely wild with terror. He scrambled backward across the floor, trying to find somewhere to hide, but there was absolutely nowhere left to go. Calvin and Rosalind huddled together on the floor, crying hysterically as the reality of their imminent arrests finally became tangible. "Enjoy your new social circle, Mom and Dad," I said, watching the red and blue lights wash over their terrified faces. "I hear the federal penitentiary has a lovely cafeteria." Before any of them could respond, a massive booming crash echoed through the estate. The heavy oak front doors of the mansion were violently kicked open. The sound of shattering glass and splintering wood reverberated through the vast hallways. Dozens of heavy tactical boots swarmed into the marble foyer, their footsteps echoing clearly through the office walls. Stern voices commanded everyone to stay on the ground. The tactical teams were moving through the house with absolute precision, clearing every room. I sat back in my chair at the federal safe house and took a slow sip of my bitter black coffee. The monitors bathed my face in a pale green glow. Marcus stood behind me, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder as we watched the tactical teams breach the office doors on the security feed. Heavily armed agents swarmed into the mahogany room, shouting commands and forcing Trent and Calvin to the floor. My mother shrieked as they secured her wrists behind her back with heavy plastic zip ties. Brianna did not even resist when they placed the cuffs on her. She simply stared at the blank wall, completely dead inside. I reached out and pressed a single key on my laptop, severing the remote connection. The screens in the safe house faded to black, leaving only the low humming sound of the servers. I closed my eyes and breathed in the cool, sterile air of the facility. Malik was safe. My husband's memory was honored. The predators who had masqueraded as my family were finally locked in a cage of their own making. I stood up from the workstation and walked out of the server room, leaving the ghosts of my past behind me forever. Marcus followed me out into the brightly lit corridor of the federal building, his heavy tactical boots echoing against the polished linoleum floor. He caught up to me just as I reached the heavy glass exit doors, and he held up a set of keys, jingling them softly in the quiet hallway. He looked at me with a profound understanding of exactly what I had just accomplished, and asked if I wanted to take a ride. He knew that watching the raid on a glowing computer monitor in a sterile server room was not going to be enough to wash away the years of psychological torture and abuse I had endured. I needed to breathe the air and feel the physical reality of their kingdom burning to the ground. I nodded silently and followed him out into the humid Atlanta night, climbing into the passenger seat of his unmarked black federal vehicle. We drove through the empty downtown streets in absolute silence, the streetlights flashing rhythmic patterns across the windshield. As we approached the exclusive gated communities of Buckhead, the quiet night was completely shattered by the wailing chorus of police sirens. We turned onto the winding, tree-lined avenue where my parents' sprawling estate was located, and the sky was completely illuminated by a blinding storm of red and blue flashing lights. The massive wrought iron security gates that Calvin had spent a fortune installing to keep the commoners away had been violently rammed open by a federal tactical vehicle. The heavy metal bars were twisted and broken, hanging uselessly off their stone pillars. Marcus parked the SUV a few houses down, and we walked together along the pristine, manicured sidewalk. The scene unfolding in front of my parents' mansion was absolutely chaotic and perfectly poetic. The perfectly landscaped front lawn that my mother obsessed over was completely torn to shreds by the heavy treads of armored federal trucks. Dozens of heavily armed agents in dark windbreakers were swarming the property, shouting commands and securing the perimeter. But the most devastating part of the entire spectacle was not the federal agents or the flashing lights. It was the neighbors. The absolute pinnacle of Atlanta high society had poured out of their multi-million-dollar mansions to watch the destruction. The same elite surgeons, corporate executives, and investment bankers that my parents had spent their entire lives desperately trying to impress were now standing on the sidewalks and in their driveways watching the downfall. They were wearing expensive silk robes and designer cashmere loungewear, clutching their glowing smartphones and recording every single second of the humiliation. The Neighborhood Watch Association was completely paralyzed, simply standing by and gossiping as the ultimate symbol of pristine wealth was violently dismantled. The carefully curated facade of black excellence that my family had weaponized against me for my entire life was being broadcast live to the entire neighborhood, and it would soon be splashed across every major news network in the country. I stood quietly in the shadows near a massive oak tree watching the front doors of the estate. Trent was the first one dragged out of the house. Two massive federal agents had him by the arms, hauling him down the wide marble front steps. His custom-tailored designer suit was ripped at the shoulder, and his expensive silk tie was hanging loosely around his neck. He was kicking and thrashing like a captured animal, completely unhinged and screaming at the top of his lungs. He was demanding to speak to his lawyers and threatening to sue the federal government, claiming he was a highly respected investment banker who was being illegally targeted. But the agents did not care about his corporate pedigree. They slammed him forcefully over the hood of a federal cruiser and patted him down, spreading his legs and treating him exactly like the common criminal he truly was. The arrogant, untouchable predator who had mocked my late husband and tried to steal my son's future was reduced to a weeping, sweating mess, begging for mercy. as they shoved him violently into the back of the caged vehicle. Brianna was let out next. The golden child, the brilliant Ivy League surgeon, the absolute pride and joy of the family legacy emerged from the house in handcuffs. She was completely catatonic. Her eyes were empty and glazed over, staring blankly at the flashing blue lights. She had built her entire existence on the illusion of superiority and the validation of a man who secretly despised her. Now she was facing decades in federal prison for attempted murder and conspiracy. The heavy silver bracelets dug into her wrists as an agent guided her toward a separate transport vehicle. She did not look at the neighbors, and she did not look at her husband. She just walked like a hollow ghost, completely stripped of her arrogance and her medical licenses. Her perfect life was gone forever. Then came my parents. Calvin was practically being carried by the agents, his legs refusing to support his weight. The domineering patriarch who had ordered my commitment to a psychiatric ward and laughed at my pain was openly sobbing. He looked incredibly small and fragile, his expensive grooming and his commanding presence completely washed away by the absolute terror of losing his wealth and his freedom. He kept shaking his head back and forth as they marched him past his ruined lawn, muttering about his country club memberships and his frozen bank accounts. Rosalind was fighting the agents every step of the way. She was completely hysterical, her makeup running down her face in dark streaks, and her perfectly styled hair wild and tangled. She was screaming at the neighbors, demanding that they stop recording, and threatening to call the police on them completely, forgetting that the police were the ones dragging her away in zip ties. She tripped on the bottom step and fell to her knees, her expensive designer dress tearing against the concrete, but the agents just hauled her back to her feet without a single ounce of sympathy. I stepped out from the shadows of the oak tree and walked slowly onto the edge of the illuminated driveway. The red and blue strobe lights washed over my face as I stood there perfectly calm and completely untouchable. Rosalind saw me standing on the sidewalk and she absolutely froze. The frantic struggling stopped and her eyes locked onto mine through the chaotic sea of federal agents and flashing lights. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, desperate venom. She realized in that exact moment that I was not a victim, and I was not a broken widow. I was the architect of the entire operation. I was the one who had brought the federal government to her doorstep. She lunged forward, straining against the grip of the agents holding her arms. "Corinne," she screamed, her voice cracking and echoing over the noise of the idling police cruisers. "You did this to us. We are your blood. How could you do this to your own mother? You are nothing without this family, Corinne. You are nothing." I stood there and let her desperate, hateful words wash over me. I did not flinch, and I did not feel a single ounce of guilt or sadness. I looked at the woman who had handed me a poisoned cup of tea and left me to die in the freezing mountains just to steal a phantom fortune. I looked at the people who had sacrificed my humanity on the altar of their toxic ambition. They had spent my entire life trying to convince me that I was a failure because I valued love and peace over money and status. They had tried to break my spirit and steal my child. I took a step closer to the edge of the driveway, making sure she could see the absolute clarity and peace in my eyes. I did not raise my voice, but I knew she could hear me perfectly over the sirens. "I was nothing with this family, Mom," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "Now, I am everything." Rosalind let out a guttural, devastating wail as the agents finally pushed her down into the back of the police cruiser and slammed the heavy door shut, cutting off her screams. I watched the caravan of federal vehicles pull away from the curb, their tires rolling over the ruined grass as they carried the ashes of my toxic bloodline off into the dark. The neighbors were still recording, whispering excitedly among themselves, but I did not care about them either. They were just ghosts in a world I was leaving behind. Marcus walked up beside me and gently touched my arm, asking if I was ready to go. I nodded and turned my back on the massive empty mansion. I did not look back at the broken gates or the shattered illusions of black excellence. I just kept walking down the quiet street, leaving the chaos and the flashing lights far behind me in the distance. We walked 2 blocks down to where a modest and incredibly safe crossover SUV was parked quietly under a street lamp. The windows were deeply tinted, and the engine was humming softly. I opened the heavy back door, and the warm, inviting smell of high-end roasted meat immediately hit my senses. Malik was sitting safely in his booster seat, completely oblivious to the federal raid and the destruction of his grandparents' empire. He had a massive pair of noise-canceling headphones over his ears, watching a cartoon on his tablet, and happily chewing on a thick, juicy Wagyu beef burger that Marcus had arranged for him earlier in the evening. He looked up when I opened the door, his eyes bright and completely untouched by the darkness of the world. "Hey, Mom," he said, offering me a greasy smile and holding up a French fry. "This burger is really good." I felt a sudden overwhelming rush of pure, unconditional love. I leaned into the back seat and kissed his warm forehead, smoothing his hair back. "I am so glad you like it, baby," I whispered, my voice thick with genuine emotion. "We are going to go on a long trip now, just you and me." I closed his door and climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel. I looked at Marcus standing on the curb. He gave me a slow, respectful nod of acknowledgement, a silent confirmation that the job was done and we were finally free. I put the SUV into drive and slowly pulled away from the curb. I drove out of the wealthy suburban nightmare, navigating the quiet, winding roads until we reached the highway. I merged onto the empty interstate, leaving the toxic ambition and the greedy predators trapped in their federal cages. I drove steadily into the peaceful, quiet night, wrapping my son in a blanket of total safety and heading toward a beautiful, simple future that belonged entirely to us. The greatest lesson from this story is that blood does not always mean loyalty. Sometimes the people who should protect you are the ones you need protection from. When a family builds its foundation on greed and status, they will eventually destroy themselves. Corinne proved that true strength comes from patience, intelligence, and knowing your own worth. You never have to accept a toxic environment just because they are family. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away and let them face the consequences of their own actions while you protect your peace. If you have ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your peace, share your story in the comments below.